We are in the middle of a series called Chatterbox, which is an adaptation to a series that Stephen Furtick has done, and we have made it applicable to us. And so last 2 weeks ago, we began the series talking about defining the Chatterbox. And this idea that we kind of framed as empty calories. There's things in our lives that we can fill ourselves with that don't lead to life. They actually lead to unhealth. And they're lies and they're voices that oftentimes we believe. And really what they do mostly is they drown out the voice of God. And we gave an example last week of the story of Moses and how insecurities in his life, the realization that he was a mess or that he was marginal or that he was miserable and all of these things and the effect that insecurity had on his life and that he didn't realize that God says, I am. You know, we talk in the ideas of insecurity that I don't think I can. That's it. That's insecurity, right? Or if we think about, I think I can, and that's pride. And the focus of pride is ourselves. We think we can do it. And the focus of insecurity is others, that we don't think we can do it. But when we talk about humility, we talk about hearing God's voice, we hear that God says to us, I am. And so what we're looking at in this series is overpowering lies with God's promises. God says, I am. God says, I will. Do you believe that today? That God says He will do it in your life? Because today's topic is the not insecurity, but the empty calories of fear. We're going to talk about this idea of fear today. And one of the things that's abundantly clear as we think about fear is that most often it's a trip to fear. It's a trip to fear. We have to take a trip to go and be fearful. We don't normally just arrive at anxieties or worries or panic or dread or fear. But when you think about your trip to fear, it's normally a collection or a compilation or an accumulation of situations or experiences or even examples or demonstrations, a tour to fear, if you would. It's this combination of circumstances and an accumulation of experiences that made us fearful. And so often when we talk about trips or going on a trip, we don't often take trips without GPS now. There's these instructions, these directions. And I thought about that this week, that you know what? The trip to fear is not devoid of instructions or directions. We don't have to take the trip to fear by ourselves. There's a chatterbox. There's the enemy within me that will go with us along the way, will talk us all the way through our trip to fear. See, instead of directions that lead us to good places, the directions or the instructions we receive on the trip to fear are lies. That we believe lies as our instructions or our directions to some destination. And our fears are those landmarks, those prominent landmarks along the trip. And you know as well as I do, if you struggle with fear or you have struggled with fear, that fear leads us to dark towns where there's no hope or joy or peace. And we're not necessarily talking about just the capital F fears, the big ones, but we're talking in a lot of respects about little f fears, like the things that we just kind of think that come with the territory, we just assume are part of life's package, that backpack of nervousness we always have. You know, we just assume that that's what life is supposed to be like. That's just kind of how things are supposed to happen. That we will always have some level of anxiety or some level of fear that we have to carry with us, and that we have, in so many ways, just assumed that it is part of the life story. And I'm here to say, and I think God is here to say, that it doesn't always have to be that way. Fear does not always have to be part of our story. We don't always have to be hesitant or have that daily anxiety. I mean, if you know, in my story, there's some times where I'm anxious about things going good. It's not just about bad stuff like, oh man, things are always, no, when things are good, I'm like, well, it's not going to be good for much longer. Like I got anxiety about good times. because it might just end. And so it's not just bad times we have anxiety or nervousness or fear about. We sometimes are fearful of the good times. And so this trip to fear needs to be replaced with a trip to life, a trip to truth, a trip to wholeness, places that you want to go, the person you want to be. See, the Chatterbox so often is putting up big neon signs, exit signs, that say, this exit's closed. When you desire to be who God called you to be, or you desire to go and do what God's called you to do, so often the Chatterbox is right there with a big bright neon sign that says, closed. You can't go that way. And then there's some reason, some lie that says that part of your life needs to remain unexplored. Church, you know that the trip doesn't end until we die. So it does matter what directions we listen to, and we must not listen to the directions that have lies in them or landmarks that we believe are haunted or exits that do not look open to us. We can choose the places we go and the people that we become. And so the goal in this series is not to eliminate all of the empty calories. There's just really no way to eliminate the enemy. But what we want to do is we want to minimize his or their impact on our life. And so last week we talked about insecurities, and this week we're going to talk about fears. They're not going away. It's always going to be insecurities. There's always going to be fears, but we can choose not to follow their directions. We can choose not to travel to those places. We can plan to listen to God's voice, his instructions, and look at his landmarks, which are called promises. Amen? That God has many promises throughout his word that are landmarks that we need to pay attention to. And so I want us to look at Acts chapter 27. And so if you have your Bible with you, we are actually going to stay in Acts chapter 27 the entire morning. And so you can just kind of walk down through. I'm going to walk down through the story, and we can do this together. We actually looked at this passage back last summer, and really for a different reason. And so even though it's the same story, it's really an entirely different message today. And so I want us to look back at Acts chapter 27 and really just try to begin to expand on this story of Paul. Now, we know Paul. Paul was a hater of the way. Initially, he was the one given instructions and given authority to crucify and to kill those who were part of this Jesus' new way. And after a while, he's radically converted, and he begins to preach all over the known world. And his preaching and his teaching and his letters to different churches are really a majority of the New Testament. The second half of the Bible that you read mostly is about Paul and his church planting. And so part of Paul's story, part of Paul's journey with Jesus involves persecution and prison. That he actually handled a lot of trouble as he was walking with Jesus. And we pick up this story in Acts chapter 27, where he is sailing as a prisoner to Rome to stand trial. And so he's on this boat heading to Rome to stand trial for being a Christian. And it's about this time of the year, about the fall of the year, and they're traveling. And we pick up the story in Acts chapter 27, verse 9. Acts chapter 27, verse 9. And we begin to see, it says in the first couple of verses there, 9 and 10, it says, much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after fast. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. And so Paul, he is a preacher, not a pilot. He is not a sailor, but he begins to share with these men, the captors, those who are with him. He's saying, listen, this isn't going to turn out well. How about we stop? How about we lodge here for the winter? And Paul represents, and this is a big piece of the story you need to remember, Paul represents the word. Paul represents the truth on this trip. He's the truth on board. And so he's giving a warning, and they do not heed his warning. In Acts chapter 27, verse 11, it says, "But the centurion, the guy in charge, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter, the majority decided that they should sail on." And so as we set up this story, Paul says, listen, I know I'm a prisoner, I know I'm nobody significant here, but I don't think we should sail on. I think we should stop. But those who were in charge, those who had the experience, those who were the property owner, those who had the majority opinion, that was the voice that was listened to. Because they were traveling by their senses. I mean, we can agree, right? So Paul, not a sailor, but he had some insight. He was not trusting his senses because he didn't know what and how to be a sailor. He was trusting the Spirit. There was something in his spirit that said, listen, this isn't going to work out very well. Maybe we should stop here. But those whose voices were listened to were the ones that were the experts, the ones that had their senses, the ones that had been trained. And so the first point I want us to make is that sometimes we travel by our senses when we need to be traveling by our spirit. Verse 13, we see the travels become difficult. Verse 13, it says, when the gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted. So they thought, maybe this is going to work out well. Forget that guy, Paul, who talked and said it wasn't going to work out. So they weighed an anchor and sailed along the shore to Crete. Before very long. How many know that's true, right? We think it's going to turn out well, but before very long, things start turning bad. Indications that were ignored start catching up with us. And so it starts catching up with them. They didn't heed the advice of the preacher, and now that south gentle wind starts turning into a hurricane. It says in verse 14, before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the nor'easter swept down from the island. And then the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. And so now things start turning very badly for the crew and the prisoners. Verse 14 says, before too long. Verse 15, and this is where I want us to kind of look more closely at the story. It says in verse 15, the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. Now, I don't know what storm you're in now or what storms you have encountered, but if we pull this into the fear spectrum, if we pull this into the emotional spectrum, when the high emotions, when the high winds come, do we just go with them? It says that the high winds came up and they just gave way to them and were driven along. What do we do when the high winds of emotion come? What do we do when the high fear, the high insecurity, the high shame comes? Do we just give into it and are we just driven along? I mean, when the anger comes up in us, do you just go with it? Or are you just driven along? How about when agitation comes up, when disconnection comes up, when jealousy comes up? Do we just go with it? Are we just like this boat in the story with Paul's on? They just go with it. They were just driven along. They felt like there was nothing they could do. They just have to go with the sadness. I wake up one day and I just feel terrible and I just am driven along. I'm just taken along. I have no control. Temptation comes up, just driven along. Follow it. Go with it. Worry comes up. Maybe just the status quo comes up, and you just go with it. What do we do? Where do we go? How do we respond when the high winds of emotion come up? These men simply gave way to it, says, and were driven along. They gave no resistance to the emotions because they felt like they had no choice. The Chatterbox is saying, this is just the way it's going to be. There's no need to resist. I mean, is that true? That things come up in our life and we feel like we have no option. We must just be driven along. There's no way out of this. We just might as well go with it. And the story just becomes much, much more interesting at this point. So when they realize there's nothing more they can do, they simply just have to be taken by the winds and just go with it and give way to it. Their attention no longer is on resisting the effects of the wind, they have vain attempts to save the ship. And we can read in 16, 17, 18, and 19, they do all kinds of things. The first thing to do in 16 is they pull in the lifeboat. So the lifeboat, they were in a larger craft, and they were just pulling this lifeboat along just in case. And it started dragging them and affecting them. So they pull the lifeboat in, and then the next thing they do is they try to place cords around the boat that's falling apart. And they're just so worried about this boat, and this is their way out, and this is their way through. And so they say, whoa, we got to try to secure this boat. And then they pull down part of the sail. And then in verse 18, they lighten the ship by throwing out some of the cargo. And then a couple of days later, they don't feel like that's working, and so they start throwing off the furniture. They are doing everything they can to try to save the boat. This situation has become unstable. It's out of control. And so they begin discarding things. And for our purposes, I believe they start blaming things. This situation's out of control. It must be the cargo's fault. Get rid of the cargo. It must be the furniture's fault. Get rid of the furniture. It must be this person's fault. Let's get rid of him or get rid of them. The situation's out of control. And the reason why they're trying to do all of these things and saving the ship or saving the boat is because their faith was in the boat. They were taking their cues from the situation, their senses, from their surroundings. Not the voice of life, not the voice of truth, who just a couple of days earlier was saying, listen, we should probably not go any further. And see, they get themselves into this mess, and the emotions are high, and the winds are blowing, and they begin to start blaming and throwing out things, and they're on this trip to fear. And the trip to fear takes a major transition in verse 20. When neither sun nor star appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So for 3 verses, they're just trying to do everything they can to hold the boat together. They do everything they can to try to save their transportation. But now it's come to the point in verse 20 that the trip to fear has become fear fulfilled. Their despair has delivered them to depression. It says in the scriptures that there's no sun and no stars. There's no indication that it's ever going to get better. There's no longer evidence that they're going to get out of here. There's no guidance to the situation getting any better. It's dark and distracted, and they're unable to discern any way out. Isn't that what fear is? Dark, distracted, and unable to discern any way out. It's a trip to fear. And it looks like in this story, the trip to fear is now fear fulfilled. Church, this is a nightmare. But too often in our lives, it's a nightmare at noon. It doesn't have to be dark. It doesn't have to be at night. Doesn't have to be in the middle of the day. Our nightmares can be at noon, where our eyes are open, but our minds are closed to God. We are seeing everything around us, and we're fearful of everything. Our senses are taking in everything, and it's saying, listen, everything's falling apart around us. Our boat that we have faith in is falling apart. We've done everything we can to try to repair the boat, and now there's no way out. And it's never going to get any better. It's been 11 days now. Maybe for you it's been 11 months. Maybe it's been 11 years that you've been dealing with this fear, this trip to fear. And now it's come to the point in this story, and maybe in your life and in my life, we feel like that trip to fear is now fear fulfilled. See, we have so future tripped. Have I ever used that term before? Have I said that term before? Future tripping? So what these men have done is that they have made an observation with their senses, right? They've taken inventory of what they think it's going to turn out, and then they've already put the conclusion. They said, you know what? We've looked at everything here, and we've decided that it's over. This is not going to end well. We've lost all hope. We haven't seen the sun. We haven't seen the stars. It's over. What they're doing is they're future tripping. They're saying, we know, we're going to predict the future of how this is going to turn out, and we've come to the conclusion that it doesn't end well. They're future tripping. It's kind of like it's like a mental 100-car pileup. You have one bad thought, right, on Monday. And guess what happens? Monday afternoon, another one comes. And it just starts piling up, and then another one comes, and here comes another one. Boom, 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 boom. And what has happened is we basically have a trip to fear. We have a fear fulfilled, that we have this huge, massive 100-car mental pileup. And we future trip to the point where we say, you know what? My eyes are open, but my mind is closed that this is ever going to get any better. That's where these men were at. They decided, we haven't seen any indication. There's no evidence that this is going to get better. Church, what we need to say, if this is true in your life, stop. Stop. Slow. We can determine where we go on our mental trips. Now, I want you to know that, right? You have control of your mind. You have control of what trips your mind takes. And we need to say, we need to stop, and we need to slow, because here's the truth of the matter. These men on this boat were on a trip to fear, but Paul was still on a trip to Rome. At no point did Paul think that this was going to end well or end badly. He hasn't even talked. He hasn't said anything before since he said, listen, we shouldn't go anywhere. After get this brother a glass of water or something. You all right? All right. I'm worried about you. We have to stop. We need to slow. We need to recognize when we're on this trip to fear, we need to tune back in to the truth and to the word. And so Paul is still on the boat, even though these guys have decided that it's over. They decided it's never going to get any better, but Paul is still on the boat. The truth is still on the trip. Amen? No matter when you're on a trip to fear, no matter when you think fear has been fulfilled, truth is still on board. It is still available to you. You can still lean into it. You can still tune into it. You can still listen to it. And so let's look where Paul speaks up again. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice." That's interesting, right? He's basically saying, I told you so. You should have listened to me. You should have listened to me. I told you a long time ago that this wasn't going to go well, but you didn't listen to me. That's the first thing he says. You didn't listen to me. And then what does he say? Look with me in verse 21. It says, after the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you have not you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss." And then here are maybe the best two words of the whole story. Verse 22, but now. But now. Paul's done. Yeah, you know what? You should have taken my advice. You should have, you could have, you did, you didn't, but now. You know, it doesn't matter what happened in the past. Now I'm focused on now. But now. We're going to do something now. You didn't listen to me before, but you can still listen to me now. You might have been on a trip to fear, but now you can be on a trip to truth. Amen? Church, this is the truth. That we can still tune into the truth even when we've been on a trip to fear. And so Paul answers the question, will you help me? Is there still hope? Paul answers and says, yes, God says he will do it. Verse 22. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Not denying what has happened in the past, not denying what you should have or you could have done, but now keep up your courage. The boat, not the body, is the only thing that will be lost. Now, church, if you're sleeping, I want you to wake up, because I think this is really, really significant. And I think this is where we need to really dive into this passage. Because I think what Paul says here is very, very significant. The way you thought it was going to work out may be destroyed, but you will not be destroyed. That's basically what he's saying to these men. Listen, you thought the boat was going to transport you from here to there. You thought that marriage was going to be what's going to make you happy. You thought that this was going to work out. You thought this is what you wanted. Now listen, that may have been destroyed, but you will not be destroyed. You thought the boat was the cure. You thought the boat was the solution, but I am the solution. And so the boat might be destroyed, but you will not be destroyed. But here's the problem. If our faith is in the boat, our faith is destroyed. And then we're on the trip to fear. Because what we thought was going to be sustaining us, what we put our faith in, we are watching crumble. And if you have your faith in something that's crumbling, then your faith is being broken. But if your faith is what is instead fast, if your faith is in the one who says, I am, it doesn't matter what's happening to the boat. It doesn't matter what's happening to the circumstances. It doesn't matter what's happening in the surroundings. Your faith is secure in the one who says, I am. See, as opposed to faith in the boat, we must have faith in God. Because God says He will. I want to note real quick where Paul says, keep your courage up. Do you think that the storm has to stop for the courage to go up? Do you think the boat has to stay intact for the courage to stay up? It seems that Paul is separating out the courage going up, the faith going up, outside of whether or not the storm stops, outside whether or not the boat makes it. He's saying, listen, your courage has to come up because your courage and faith has to be in me, not in the storm or the boats. And in verse 23 and 24, it says, last night, and here's the reason why he can speak so confidently. Last night, an angel of the God who I am, last night, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who will sail with you. And so basically, Paul has been assured that no matter what happens with the storm, whether the rain starts or stops, or the boat makes it or it doesn't, God has promised that He will see all of these men all the way through. So there's no need for a trip to fear. You know, so often I think what the Chatterbox does is that he gets us with two words. What if? What if this happens? What if that happens? Well, that's really what just accelerates our fear, is that we begin to think about what if. What if that happens? What if I never get pregnant? What if I never get married? What if that I get cancer? What if? Here's what I want to say to you today. What if that does happen? What if it did happen already? Does that mean God's not present? Does that mean God's dead? Does that mean God's not working? Does that mean God's not going to help? Here's the solution. What if that happens? If it happens, God will still be there. God will still provide. God will still rescue. God will repair. God will hear. God will protect. God will stand with you. So there's no need to be afraid of what if, because if it happens, God's still going to be there. And I think, church, and I may not be able to say this eloquently enough, but I think that robs fear of its power. If we say, What if it happens? Okay, let's just assume it does. What? God's still going to be there. God's still going to do it. God's still going to rescue. God's still going to provide. God's still going to repair. God's still going to hear. Now listen, I don't want us to walk around thinking, yeah, you know what, everything bad that I could think of is going to happen. No, I want you to stay in the what if. I'm sorry, my microphone keeps like falling down like under my chin here. I want us to stay with this what if question just long enough, not to get depressed and get discouraged, but just to rob fear of its power. Because if we're afraid of what if you say, okay, if it happens, God's still going to be there. Because God says He will be there. So church, I want to try to look for the runway here and bring this in for a landing, because I think that there are some final things that I want to share with you that I really think God has really helped me to give to you today. And I want us to hear them, but I want us to really concentrate as we wind down here. Look with me and let's go all the way to verses 41 and 42 at the end of the story. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. Exactly what Paul said happened. It happened. What if the ship wrecks? It did. It did wreck. It did wreck. So we see it, right? So verse 41, but the ship struck the sandbar and ran aground. The boat stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. After all that Paul had shared with them, now they want to take it out on him. The soldiers plan to kill the prisoners and prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But I love this, right? So they're going to kill Paul. They're going to kill all the prisoners. But in verse 43 it says, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. Verse 44, the rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of ship. In this way, everyone reached the land in safety. Church, what we see here is, even though the boat was destroyed, not one man was lost. Everyone made it to their destination. God is doing things even when we can't see that He's doing them. When people are trying to kill, when the enemy's trying to kill, when the chatterbox is trying to discourage, God is keeping us for a purpose. God is preserving us for His purposes. So the trip to fear can stop. I want you to know that today. The trip to fear can stop, and we can begin to go where God is keeping for us. So I have this illustration I want to show you. And so I'm going to distort stop signs for the rest of your life right here. Ready? Watch this. So I have my stop sign. Don't ask me where I got it. I might have to lie to you. I really don't know where I got it, so I wouldn't have to lie because I don't know. I don't remember. So here's the thing. Ready for this? Stop and slow. The trip to fear. The trip to fear. Okay? Here's what I want us to do. We need to stop seeing the enemy's plans. Stop seeing the opponent's plans. Stop seeing the opponent's plans. You know, that's what fear is. Fear is seeing the opponent's plan and being consumed by what the enemy is trying to plan for you, what the enemy wants to bring your way. We need to stop seeing the opponent's plan. We need to stop seeing the opponent's purposes. We need to stop seeing the opponent's propaganda. We need to stop seeing the opponent's poop. Right? Because that's all it is. We got to stop that. That's what a trip to fear is. It's saying, listen, everything that could go wrong is going to go wrong. Everything that the enemy's planning for me is going to come to pass in my life. Everything that the person that doesn't like me or what they're saying about me is going to come true. Stop seeing the opponent's plan. Start listening to the omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresence will. Start listening to this guy's will. Right here, the O, the omnipresent, the omnipotent, right? The omniscient, the will, the God who is omnipotent, the God who is omnipresent, the God who's omniscient has a will for your life. We need to start listening to his will for our life. Stop seeing the enemy's plan. Stop seeing the enemy's plan. Start listening to the omniscient, the omnipotent, and the omnipresence will for our life. Can I share with you a real conversation? I hope it doesn't offend anybody. That's going to be really... So I think my son is the youngest in the room, well, that can understand what I'm about to say. So I will not be offended, so you don't be offended. I had a real conversation. This is how I'm going to end the service. So I have these awesome conversations on Friday nights on a bus. I'm with a football team, and I talk to the coaches, and I'm not going to tell you what coach it was. But anyway, so it comes up in conversation, is it okay to say GD, right? So, God damn. Are we allowed to say that? I'm like, what? And so I say, okay, here's how I started my answer. Okay, here's the thing. Is a good rule of thumb, if you're talking to him, use his name. Okay? If you're not talking to him, don't use his name. So that's the beginning of my answer. The second is, specifically to the GD, I asked this kid that was asking me, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to say that? What are you saying when you say that? I mean, it's really what are you asking him to damn? If you're talking to him, God damn, what? Like what? What do you want him to do? And I thought about that conversation as I was finishing my sermon for yesterday. Maybe that's what it is. When we live without the O, in slow, start listening to the will, right? To will. If we miss without the O, it's really just GD, right? And that's how we feel. We feel lost and we feel damned. When we're not listening to the O, when we're not listening to the omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent one, we feel like God's mad at me. I'm not good enough. I've messed up too much. And we're really living a GD life. But God, the omnipotent one, the omnipresent one, the omniscient one, is the one who wants you to listen to him. Amen? That's who we are. That's whose we are. We have to stop seeing the opponent's plan. The trip to life, the trip to truth, the trip to love is based around God's O's being for our good. His all-knowing is a guide for you and me. His all-power is strengthening to you and me. His all-presence is comfort to you and me along our journey. Amen? I mean, think about that. If we would listen to the omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent one, how could we fear anything? There is nothing beyond the realm of God's authority. Do you believe that? There's nothing beyond the realm of God's authority. And so if he's all-knowing, if he's all-powerful, if he's all-present, what do we have to fear? Because he's pulling for you. He wants you to listen to him. Start listening to his will for your life. And as Stephen Furtick says, the voice you believe determines the future you will experience. The voice you believe will determine your future experience. And so if we can stop seeing the opponent's plan and start listening to the omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent one and his will for our life, there's nothing to fear. Nothing to fear. Amen? Church, that helped me. That helps me. I hope it helps you. I hope for the next week you look at every stop sign saying, I'm not looking at the opponent's plan. I'm going to stop seeing the opponent's plan. I'm going to stop seeing the worst that could happen in this situation. I'm going to stop putting my trust in the boat. And I'm going to start putting my trust in the omnipotent one, the the omnipresent one, the omniscient one, the one who is for me, the one who loves me, the one who died for me, the one who is walking with me. Church, that is a trip to life. That's a trip to truth. That's a trip to peace. That's a trip to hope. That is not a trip to fear.